Over a century ago, during the First World War, specifically in 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, announcing the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. With that single promise, an inferno was lit in Palestine, one that has ignited from then until the present day, unleashing a slow, relentless eruption of dispossession and forced displacement, a lava of silence, of erasure, of genocide still fragmenting over time. Today, more than 6 million Palestinian refugees carry the inherited exile of 750,000 ancestors uprooted in 1948. Expelled from their homes and scattered across a world still unwilling to see. More than 563 villages were destroyed or erased from the map, not just as places, but as worlds lost to history, yet etched into collective memory. A catastrophe that continues to echo, fracture, and multiply. As we mark 77 years since the Nakba, Gaza stands at the edge of history again, bleeding, besieged, and burning. Over 1.5 million Palestinians are now witnessing a genocide unfold in real time. Another chapter in a long story of exile. Another act in a tragedy without end. They wait under the shadow of what is called Trump's plan, proposal that reopens old wounds under new names. This Nakba has entered a new era, an era of documented massacres, live-streamed despair, and deliberate destruction. Since late 2023, the United Nations and other international bodies have raised urgent alarms, banned weapons used in crowded civilian areas, homes and hospitals reduced to ash, and an ecological wound that will scar generations yet unborn. Tonight, we are honored to welcome three voices of conscious witnesses across time and place to help us reflect on the arc of forced displacement from Balfour to Trump. Former Deputy Jan Vanberg, investigative researcher Professor David Miller, and human rights activist Oscar Bergman. You are invited to join us not only to ask what had happened, but to confront the question that continues to haunt us. How has the world allowed this to happen again? At its core, diplomacy walks a tightrope between politics and principles, trying to harmonize strength with justice. But in a world where power often overrides moral values, can diplomacy still be a force for truth?
Thank you. I think that I have to return to the end of my ambassadorship because I had to retire, and that was in 2004. I knew what I was about when I was serving in the Arab world, in the Yemens, and later on one Yemen, and further on in Saudi Arabia. And then you get the confrontation between the policies of the Netherlands, which I should advance, and on the other side, our senses, our feeling of justice. So I was glad that I was released from the obligations serving the government's policies. And then I had to desperately try to find a common stand that we can all share. And where I ended up was not, for instance, at the Balfour declaration, not at the League of Nations, but on the Constitution of the Netherlands. And the Constitution, in Article 94, says that international law overrides Netherlands law. And we ignore this. So I found basically the introduction and the possibilities in the international law, and of course then in the International Courts of Justice and the International Criminal Court.
Very interesting. So then I was going to ask if we consider you tonight the ambassador of truth, of justice, based on this fact. Plan that didn't fall far from Balfour Street. He continues to impose social engineering, not through sudden imperial shocks, but through long-term systematic strategy aimed at fracturing Palestinian social structures and creating vast cultural voids. In this case, how can we view the right of return not just as an act of resistance, but a deliberate move toward reweaving the fabric of Palestinian society?
The right of return is, of course, fundamental to the Palestinian cause. And many people say that if we just have the right of return, that everything will magically work itself out after that. And of course, there are many different strategies for the liberation of Palestine. But at the core of them all is, of course, the right of return, because the right of return would mean that there would be a Palestinian majority in the historic territory of Palestine, and it would mean, if there was any form of democracy at all, the end of the Zionist entity. And so, I mean, for me, the question that is often put to supporters of Palestine is, well, they say, do you want to see, or you do want to see, the end of the state of Israel? And some supporters of Palestine want to equivocate on that and say, well, not necessarily, it's a matter for the Palestinians and the Israelis together. And I say, well, of course, no, there can be no place for a Jewish state in the historic territory of Palestine. There can be only a place for a Palestinian state. Whether the people who live there happen to be Christians or Jews or Muslims or from some other faith is a secondary matter. It will be a Palestinian state. And the reason that you have to have a Palestinian state is because Zionism is so fundamentally racist that it cannot be reformed. There cannot be a way of coexisting with Zionism. It will always want to genocide the Palestinians. That's what it's been doing since the 1880s, and indeed before that, through to the Nakba of 1948, and of course, the second Nakba of the last year and a half. So we should be clear that the right of return is fundamental, and that the Zionist entity must be collapsed, must be removed, and those Jews who want to become Palestinians and stay and build a life with the Palestinians would be welcome. But it doesn't look like very many of the current Israelis, so-called Israelis, want to do that. So we have to find a way to deal with that as an issue. And that's of course a difficult issue, but it would have to be faced.
And what you just mentioned, Mr. Miller, reminded me in your masterpiece, in your article that was published in the Palestine Chronicle, I think last year in May, from the river to the sea, which we are going to come to. You and other fearless defenders of freedom worldwide have turned Martin Luther King Jr.'s words into a living truth. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now, acting on it, standing on the front lines against oppression, occupation, breaking the siege on Gaza, sailing to Gaza. Through your journey, tell us, how can global activism be ignited into an unstoppable force for the Palestinian right of return?
First of all, I want to say that I agree completely with Mr. Miller that the Zionist entity is not able and will never be able to live alongside with the Palestinians. And just before this meeting, I had a quick view to the articles I've been writing already 10 years ago, when it was about 70 years of Nakba. And I must say, it's going further back. I mean, it started 1917, not only with the Balfour Declaration, but also the British conquering Jerusalem, Al-Quds, in November 1917. General Allenby walked in by feet. He didn't want to come on a horse, just to show that he's not a conqueror, but bringing peace. And the British newspapers celebrated this event as 673 years of Muslim rule ended in Palestine. So, but in the same year, 1917, Gaza was completely bombed by airplanes, by the sea, and by land, and this several times until the British were able to take the path to Jerusalem on a road which was built for the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm just 10 years earlier. So it didn't start with the Nakba. It started much earlier.
Yes, before. Yes,
And
that's right. Maybe back
when you
in
see
even 1897, sorry.
the British already conquering Egypt and so on, and spying even 100 years earlier on all those territories as a form of archaeological sites, and they had this, but it was all named Palestine. They had the Palestine Declaration Fund. The Germans had the Palestina Bank. In the Balfour Declaration itself, it's mentioned a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. So it's all about Palestine. It's not about this Zionist entity, whatever it's called. It's just a brutal colonial project since the beginning. And it never stopped, because I opened some news sites today that the Zionist entity and the Americans are negotiating with countries like Sudan or Somaliland to deport the Palestinians there. So a few years ago, I printed a pullover with a name. I named it "Don't Let Bullshit Conquer the World" on my pullover, and well, it actually happened. It happened. So, as movements in Europe, I am European. My heart is beating for Palestine and Syria, but a few years ago it was hard to get some people on the street. Now you don't need to do any effort, and everybody is coming by itself.
As a diplomat with years of political experience, how did you manage to restore the true narrative in a political field where truth becomes irrelevant? One of the strategies may be that you retired. Have you visited Palestine?
Well, there's so many aspects on what you are referring to, and also the two other constituents to this discussion. My overwhelming feeling at the time of retirement was that I had to find a basis for judgment. The basements, I came out, I tried to refer to that in my first opening session, in international law. And it turned out to be a lucky guess, because it is a very, very firm establishment as what international law is about. And the International Court of Justice, to which I'm at walking distance of 10 minutes, exactly, very clear. And these are formulated in two advisory opinions to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And they're about Israel. And they put Israel quite clearly in the dock. The first one was on the 7th of July 2004, and the other one on 27 July 2024, about 24 hours later, ruinous for Israel. And that is the firm establishment. But the problem of international law is that it is only executed as it should be by the push and by the responsibility of the world. And the Western world is at guilt to this. Although it at the moment is eroding, it is eroding, and we should jump into that to advance the rights that were very well established to my previous speakers. So I could elaborate, but maybe others would like to add their views on that.
If the commercialization of replacement and displacement has turned crime into mafia-style enterprise that serves power rather than merely breaking laws, doesn't this brutal cycle expose the moral bankruptcy of the global order, proving that we are still being sold the same old snake oil, where politics was never just a game, but rather business?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, of course, the global order is bankrupt. We have known this for some considerable years, not just since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ascent of the US to the unipolar global hegemon, but we have, I think, seen the bankruptcy in much starker relief in recent years, partly as a result of US dominance, but also in the very last 4 or 5 years, the total collapse of the rhetoric of international law, of human rights, of democracy, all of which has been jettisoned by the practices, the obvious practices we've seen, especially in the last 18 months of the Zionists. The unparalleled brutality screened for anyone who wants to watch anywhere in the world for the last 18 months is something which has just destroyed the possibility that we could even think in terms of international human rights or democracy or any of the much vaunted liberal notions which were supposed to define our era. You know, after the end of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as it was called in the Soviet Union, when Nazism was defeated, there was a form of politics in the West, often referred to as social democracy, in the US, in the UK, and many European countries too, where there was some kind of compromise between capital and labor, which meant that class inequality declined. There were systems to catch the weakest and poorest in society. The National Health Service, for example, in the UK was introduced. All of these things, of course, that model of politics changed in the 1980s with the advent of neoliberalism, or the dominance of neoliberalism in Western politics. But still, in that period, it was held, although, of course, the West didn't pay any attention to these things, it was held that international law was important and human rights were important, etc. It didn't stop the US invading Grenada and Panama and Afghanistan and Iraq, etc. But we have seen the attempts to cling on to the last elements of international law with the South African government's heroic attempts to bring the Zionists to account. Of course, they've had success at the rhetorical level and at the policy level, but no success in terms of actually constraining and stopping the Zionists, bringing any of them to justice. Not at all. And that, of course, is why we must begin to see that not just that the global order of the dominance of the West is collapsing. Western societies are exploding internally for reasons which we could go into, but we probably haven't got time. We're faced with the possibility of the end of the unipolar world and the possibility of a multipolar world, and what that would mean, how that would be brought into place. But I don't believe that can be brought into place in a generalized process of the reform of economies, the collapsing of the dollar standard, or all of those kinds of processes. I believe it can only be brought into place decisively by the defeat of the US. And of course that will also has to mean the defeat of the Zionist entities. So that I think is the prognosis for the future. We're not going to get out of this problem without the military defeat of the Zionists, of the US. And it's much closer than people think. But the attempt to back off from it, and of course the way in which the US and indeed Israel have performed a brilliant success in Syria, destroying the Assad government, destroying the axis of resistance to some extent, and allowing Al Qaeda and ISIS hordes to systematically attack and execute Alawis and Christians and even Sunnis who oppose the Gilani regime.
I think the Palestinian situation remains actually very special and exceptional, and it has its own circumstances and considerations. It's a little bit different from any other place in the region. Although, if we're talking about the superpowers, they are applying the same tactic, the same proxy wars, actually, but the Palestinian cause is still very exceptional. It can't be compared to any other country in the region. Do you agree with this, Mr. Miller?
What I would say is that the point I was trying to make really is that it will not be international law, human rights, the rule of democracy, which liberates the Palestinians. It will be the Palestinian resistance that liberates the Palestinians. And the most obvious way in which they can do that, the way they've been trying to do that for the last 20 years, is through the development of the axis of resistance with Hezbollah, with the Assad government, with the popular mobilization squads in Iraq, and of course with Yemen and the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's been the axis of resistance. It would be fantastic if Jordan and Egypt and Saudi and Bahrain and the UAE were to join the axis of resistance, but they won't. We know that. What will liberate Palestine will be the Palestinians. It won't be international law. It won't be the West. It won't be millions of people on the streets in London or New York or Vienna or wherever. It will be Palestinian resistance. And that's why I say that is the crux of the matter. Destruction and the collapsing of the Zionist entity, and indeed the defeat of the US, is a crucial matter for the Palestinians.
Until the lion learns to write, the story will always glorify the hunter. Let me flip the script over, portraying the oppressor as the victim and vice versa. But you managed to turn the table on this industry that thrives on lies. Throughout time, you organized campaigns to raise awareness among a new generation so that they are prepared to challenge these fabrications. How further can this effectively work in a world where firepower, vast media empires reinforce their dark wisdom? Can truth still rise above the noise, break through the machinery of deception, and reclaim its rightful power?
Yes, the art and the politics is a very good weapon. Although Mr. Weinberg started with a poem ending on blame them for the violence. I mean, it's actually the other way around, of course, because United Nations General Assembly had several statements that the right on armed struggle against oppression. well, you have a superpower against you. So, and we see the chaos and the destruction in Gaza, but still you have these people in Gaza and in Palestine making art. Like NGO, we are not numbers. I don't know how many of them are still alive, but I'm happy that they are still spreading words in the world via social media. I think art and literature, the most effective weapon globally. I mean, the struggle on the ground is something different. I mean, but David Miller says, yes, there is there will be no peace in Palestine without the current situation. It's not possible. I mean, they are going to attack Syria. They are going to attack Lebanon. They are bombing Tehran. They are bombing Damascus. They are bombing whatever they want. Every day there's kind of bombing somewhere. So it's very hard to bring art, paintings or color against this weapons of power. And they will continue. They will continue. But
Yes,
I'm sure, because when the so-called Western countries we are walking now on the streets protesting, but you see people who want to speak at universities are blamed for being anti-Semitic. Books are getting forbidden. People getting deported, even though they have a normal visa or a green card in the United States. Germany is once again on the wrong side of history by arresting people, even when kufir, and so on, so on, so on. So we have a very shocking situation, and we are moving forward. This is not the end of this. When you go into history, this situation will come to an end as well. Not today, not tomorrow, not in 1 year, but it will come to an end, and there will be justice. We have this, and Jan Wijnberger talked about the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and also the International Criminal Court. But these courts and these systems of the Statute of Rome is obviously only for African and Asian dictators. I mean, they were very quickly to bring Duterte from the Philippines to The Hague, and I'm living in The Hague, so it was in the news here. But they let easily go the Netanyahus and the Gallants walking around free. In Europe are now getting more the anti-Zionist movements and pro-Palestine movements and getting more stronger. I mean, we have this Hind Rajab Foundation in Belgium, which is doing war criminals everywhere on the world. And we can beat them with facts only.
Activism is a very strong tool then in confronting those who are in power.
Yes. They are afraid of facts, and this is a so-called fact-free West world. The Western world, it's full of idiocy, and it's completely idiot what we are listening to every day. And people are in front of politicians, in front of microphones, blaming the Palestinians for being the victim. So. No, we should go on further on the street. Don't let this go down, and make the Zionists happy that it will be over after a time. The Palestinian conflict is the conflict of all conflicts. I mean, all conflicts can be rooted back to this conflict, because this is purely about injustice. It's about apartheid. It's about oppression. It's about everything wrong in this world. Every conflict in the world, you can go back to Palestine. So some politicians are asking, why don't you go to the street for Sudan? Well, I was in Sudan, I know. I was in Egypt, I was in Syria.
And Syria as well, yes.
But to the street for Palestine, well, because Palestine is really the root cause of all evil, what's happening there against the Palestinians. And since more than 100 years. So
that actually proof what Nelson Mandela said once, that nobody can be free if Palestine is not free. In this context, Mr. Weinberg, how can we expect the map of the world to be shaped by the Palestinian cause? It seems that based on everything that Mr. Bergman said and Mr. Miller, the world is completely changing, and Palestine this time is going to reshape the map of the world. Am I right?
When I listen to the two interventions of my predecessor just now, most of what they say, I completely agree. But one or two, I take exception. One is, it is not true, to the contrary, that international law should be bankrupt. International law is very, very interesting after all the hysterics and all the wrongdoings and so whatever you can imagine in the world. One of my friends, expert on international law, said, in the end, international law still stands. One country cannot demolish international law. It stands, but it is not implemented. And that is where the problem is. And the second element is what was said about the International Court, Criminal Court, and the bias it has. Indeed, you were right that that was the case, but it isn't anymore. Because there's a number of other countries like Bulgaria, etc., that are not the people of color. But that's not the most important issue. If you want to see the relevance of the criminal court, is what Israel has been doing to it. It was widely reported in The Guardian that they threatened the first and the second prosecutor themselves and their children and their spouses to back off. If you do that, you are, and I say that exactly on Israel, then you do not belong to the international community of states. This is the end of it. And I am deeply impressed by the huge pressure that these two prosecutors had exerted, and they just stood. They stood. American legislation against it, they couldn't care less. And when American soldiers come out here on Scheveningen, close nearby, to liberate Mr. Netanyahu, I am going there to watch. Now, that is the thing. I have a tendency, because of my background as a diplomat, to first go to the essence of it in legal terms, because that's the only thing you can operate on, and then translate it to the practice. And the point that I made, that international law cannot be destructed even by the strongest country, I learned from one of my teachers on this issue. And the second thing is that if you want to attack the wrongdoing of basically the Western world, including Australia, New Zealand, etc., go to the General Assembly. There, the United States usually got, when it was on Israel, some 300, 400, 50, 60 countries of the 190 voting with America. Now they have 9. Not even the Netherlands, my country, Panama, Argentina, the Marianas, or something, Vanuatu, or some tiny chips in the Pacific. That's all that's left in support of the United States. And when you look at the General Assembly, the Security Council, the only country there, of the 15 that are there, no other one than the United States at this moment. Every 2 years it changes, but at this moment, no other country is in favor in the Security Council. And because the United States yields the veto, it always gets their ways. And the United States and my country, as a minor country, should be leaned off this liability. It is not a sound issue, it is a dirty issue, and we should attack that.
Very interesting. That's why you always insisted on supporting human rights that are based on international law. If democracy claims to rest on the pillars of free thought and open debate or discourse, what does it reveal about its true nature when those pillars collapse the moment Palestine is mentioned? Given your experience, actually, and the article I just mentioned earlier that was published in Palestine Chronicle, you exposed how universal values through some human rights organization are weaponized to blur the line between resistance and terrorism. If South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, as you asked in your article, was once celebrated, yet those resisting Zionist settler colonialism are criminalized, and if European capitals or some European capitals welcome Netanyahu with open arms despite the ICC arrest warrant, then from a philosophical perspective, how do we address this moral issue where justice is perverted and empathy is manipulated to favor the aggressor over the victim, thus undermining the very foundation of fairness?
I thought the question was a very complex question. Let me start off with the question about democracy and the way in which freedom of speech held to be fundamental to democracy is, of course, interfered with when there are, you said where Palestine is concerned. And of course, Palestine is not the only issue historically where freedom of speech is interfered with, but it is, in the contemporary period, the most pressing, major, and obvious issue. So, of course, in previous examples where there have been settler colonial conflicts in South Africa, in Algeria, in the north of Ireland, there have been very strong attempts by the settler power, and indeed in some cases the colonial power, to censor and to the struggle of the natives, and indeed to present their struggle as being something other than what it is, i.e., to present it not as being a liberation movement, but being what's called terrorism. So, of course, that's what the Zionists do in the current case. They try and say that all resistance, or Palestinian resistance, is terrorism. And indeed, they try and expand the concept of terrorism beyond the question of armed resistance to any kind of resistance, whether it's peaceful resistance or the kind of resistance which there is. For example, in the UK, there's an organization, that the cutting edge of the anti-Zionist movement, called Palestine Action, which is involved in smashing up Israeli arms firms. In particular, it has targeted the largest Israeli arms firm, Elbit, repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, and indeed all its suppliers. Now, that's not terrorism. Everybody knows that's not terrorism, doesn't fit the definition, but there's an attempt to criminalize these very brave fighters for Palestine by calling them terrorists. So that, of course, is what they try and do. And let's remember that the idea of Palestinian terrorism being a uniquely awful form of political violence is something which the Israelis and Zionist intellectuals have been promoting for many, many years, indeed, since the mid-1980s. and you can point indeed to an origin point, which is the 1984 conference of the Jonathan Institute, named after Benjamin Netanyahu's brother, who was killed in Entebbe, where they started to introduce this idea of Islamic terrorism, an idea which has been off the television.
And you mentioned that in your book, in your What is the Islamophobia as well.
Yes. So the other thing is that rhetorically speaking, they have two strategies. One is to say these people are terrorists, and terrorism spreads beyond armed struggle to the Hamas Ministry of Health or the Hamas Ministry of Agriculture or to Palestine Action or whatever. And the second thing, of course, they have is that any anti-Zionist or anti-Israel activity or indeed comment or free speech act is actually interpreted by the Zionists, and they have an infrastructure for this, as being anti-Semitism. It's interpreted as being a form of racism against the Jews. Now, of course, it's not. Everybody who spends more than a minute reflecting on this understands that it's not to do with racism against the Jews. In fact, there isn't any racism against the Jews in the Western world today. It's simply it's not a form of racism at all. There may be some prejudice, but against Jews, but all or almost all of contemporary outpourings of anti-Zionist invective and ideology are to do with Zionism and to do with the crimes of Zionism. Everybody who pays any attention in any unbiased way knows that that's the case. But of course, the Zionists have spent 20, 30, 40 years, and in fact longer than 40 years, trying to confuse us and try and say that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. It's kind of like Nazi anti-Semitism, but instead of treating the Jews as being an inferior race, they treat Israelis as being inferior. They treat Israelis as being Jew of nations, which is a phrase which they have used repeatedly. And of course, they have an infrastructure for this, and the infrastructure is held in an organization set up by the Zionists, obviously, called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And they, of course, have a working definition of anti-Semitism, which is the same as the previous working definition of anti-Semitism they had lodged with the European Union's anti-racist body, but they then rejected it, and they had to find somewhere else to put it. So this has been something we've been trying to do for many, many decades. And so these are the twin strategies, and in every circumstance, they will reach for one or other, or sometimes both of those strategies. These people support Hamas. These people are anti-Jewish, etc., etc. These are rhetorical strategies which we should see through, and we would simply reject and indeed laugh at. And I'm glad to report that people are increasingly laughing at this, and that they have overstretched. They haven't completely given up. Of course, they are at warp speed on trying to condemn anyone who stands up for the Palestinians as being an anti-Semite, as being a terrorist supporter, and to try and have them sacked from their jobs as doctors or teachers or whatever it is, accountants or whatever. But we are increasingly fighting back against that, and that will tell there will be a tipping point where those arguments about anti-Semitism and terrorism cease to work. We're not there yet, but we're getting there.
No, the truth is not a taboo anymore. And those silly strategies are invalid, not effective at all. Mr. Bergman, you told me art can't easily confront the firepower. Looking back to Hamdallah, this boy came from that refugee with his back turned to the world. He broke the silence. He challenged the oppression and kept the Palestinian cause in the global consciousness. To which extent can art serve as a bridge between past struggles and present-day activism?
Well, all of this, well, when you focus on Palestine, I mean, there are scientists, poets, teachers, professors, all artists are attacked. So in the rest of the world, we should be strong to spread the messages of the people of Palestine. This would be the bridge. I mean, take their quotes, even when it's Mahmoud Darwish, or taking those messages and spreading them all over the world in what kind of cultural form ever. I mean, this is, you can do every, we have to create beauty to show our solidarity with completely broken people. I mean, now getting spring, and it's nice to sit outside, and this is the same everywhere on the world when you see beauty. The people of Palestine are every day confronted by the rubble, by the death threats. And even the smallest flower can bring a little happiness. So beauty is something to show. It's not as very. It can be a strong weapon when everybody take the beauty against the ugly, and those bullies shouting around in the White House or wherever with stupid ideas. Completely idiot ideas, things that are never going to happen. Inshallah, I hope, really, because you never know. But showing the beauty, if it's poetry, if it's paintings, if it's color, this is a strong weapon. When we show our solidarity, and it's on a continuous way, even in the streets. I mean, you can paint even Palestinian flags on bridges, on houses, or wherever. That this is in our hearts and minds. This is also culture. I mean, you can spread the word of Palestine, because this is the root of all conflicts. The conflict, and we have been hearing also. I mean, this was good. I mean, when you look on France, I mean, you have this resistance movement of Algeria, actually, where nobody called it the Algerian conflict, because it was just colonializing a country. And now in Palestine, we call it the Palestinian issue, or the Palestinian conflict, and it's just one party oppressing another one. And that's it. You cannot call this a conflict. A conflict is between two, at least. And this is just pure oppression since more than 100 years. And this should have an end. And we should do everything possible. Not only the Palestinians with their struggle and armed struggle, but also globally, everybody should raise his hand against this. Which is now getting normalized in especially in the West. I mean, when you go to the global South, then nobody will agree with these idiot topics we are confronted with.
Thank you
today.
so much, everyone, for joining us tonight, and thank you for watching.